Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who is connected to my electricity system. I first moved out here 10 years ago, trading in my little condominium in a busy metropolitan area for a spacious ranch property left to me by my grandfather. He passed away around that time and left me his old house and the surrounding land. I wasn't sure I wanted to uproot my entire life and head out to the countryside, but something in my gut told me that relocating might be the fresh start I needed. My grandfather and I were never super close, but as a kid I spent a couple of summers visiting him here. My memories are mostly of open meadows, dusty roads, and the tranquil comfort of lying out in the tall grass without hearing a single car horn. So I arrived on the property, bright-eyed and ready to start a quieter, calmer life. The main house was old-fashioned, with a large porch and sturdy oak beams supporting the structure. Across the long gravel driveway sat a sizable barn that Grandpa used as a storage space for his tractor, hay bales, and occasional old junk he couldn't bring himself to toss. Everything was in decent shape, but it all required a bit of love and attention. Over the years, I invested in small renovations whenever I could afford them, focusing on practicality first. The barn, for instance, needed new electrical wiring because the old system was borderline ancient. The place was so outdated that the original breaker box had corroded components, and some of the wires still had that cloth insulation typical of very old buildings. I called a professional electrician to update everything according to modern building codes, mostly because I envisioned turning the barn into a workshop for my various do-it-yourself projects. Once my renovation dust settled, I quickly learned that living out here required a bit more know-how about septic tanks, wells, and local wildlife than I was used to. Another crucial skill turned out to be dealing with neighbors. Country living often means your nearest neighbor could be half a mile away, but it also means you sometimes need each other's help, like borrowing farming equipment or providing an extra set of hands during harvest time. Community spirit can run strong, but it can also breed some complicated relationships, especially when there are old family histories at play. Over the first few years, I came to know the folks who lived on properties adjacent to mine. Most of them were pleasant. One might drop off homemade pies in the summer, and another would help me fix a tractor belt on a Sunday morning. We might wave at each other as we passed on the main road, or stop for a quick chat at the local hardware store. Among these neighbors was a man named Clayton. He lived about a quarter of a mile down the road from me, just close enough that I could see his front porch in the distance if I stood at the edge of my property by the fence. From my vantage point, his house was somewhat obscured by tall pine trees, but if I craned my neck the right way, I could catch glimpses of his yard. Clayton was around my age, maybe a few years older, and he'd always give a nod or a wave whenever he passed my driveway. I assumed he was a polite and laid-back person, but I didn't have many deep conversations with him for most of my time here. He seemed to keep to himself, except for occasionally stopping by community events at the local volunteer fire station, or chatting with folks at the gas station about the weather. He never struck me as someone who'd cause trouble. That impression changed drastically about 2 months ago, when I began noticing unusual spikes in my electric bill. Normally, my monthly statement hovers around a consistent amount, especially since I'd upgraded a lot of my home's wiring and installed some energy-efficient appliances. I also used the barn's workshop responsibly, mostly on weekends, turning off lights and machines as soon as I was finished with them. So when I saw my electric bill leap up by over $100 in 1 month, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd been tinkering in the barn more often than usual. Maybe the winter chill had me running the heater more often, but it didn't quite add up. The next month the bill jumped again, and this time it was even higher. Given that I work from home on my computer, I'm able to monitor my daily routines fairly accurately. I keep track of how many hours I run certain power tools or heating systems, just to manage costs. So I began meticulously logging my electricity usage for a couple of weeks. I flipped off the circuit breakers to certain parts of the barn if I wasn't using them, just to see if my measurements would match up with the electric bill. But even after all that caution, my usage estimates kept coming in way lower than the final bill. Something was definitely off. Initially, I wondered if I had a fault in my lines or if the power company was overcharging me by mistake. I hired a local electrician, the same one who'd upgraded the barn's wiring, to double-check for any loose or damaged cables that might be leaking power or messing with the meter readings. He examined the lines in the barn, around the house, and even the meter itself, only to tell me everything seemed in order. He did mention seeing some suspicious footprints in the dirt near the barn's outer wall, right where the electric cables entered the structure. There were partial impressions of boots, but we both shrugged, thinking maybe I'd just walked around there in the rain without remembering. Still, he advised me to keep an eye out. A week went by uneventfully, but the following Monday morning, while I was sipping my coffee and glancing out the window, I happened to notice something strange near the barn. It was just after sunrise, and a figure was walking around the side of the barn. They had their back turned to me, and they were crouched down near the junction box. My first instinct was to grab my jacket and phone and head out there. By the time I slipped on my boots and walked briskly across the yard, that figure had disappeared down the tree line. A quick look at the junction box showed me something was definitely amiss. A brand new extension cord was snaking away from my barn's side toward the fence line. I'd never seen it before. Now, let me clarify the layout. The back corner of my property, behind the barn, is separated from Clayton's land by a tall chain-link fence. We installed that fence years back, mostly to keep my dogs contained and to demarcate property lines clearly. Sure enough, the extension cord ran along the fence line, through a small gap, and into Clayton's property. I couldn't believe my eyes. This was literally an act of electricity theft. My mind spun with questions. Could Clayton be the one behind it? Why would he do something like that? Did he think I wouldn't notice? I promptly followed the cord to the fence line just to confirm it led onto his property. Right at the fence, there was an opening that someone must have cut in order to thread the cord through. I didn't see any sign of the person who had run off, and to be honest, I didn't feel safe hopping onto Clayton's property uninvited. I was already unnerved by how brazen this was. Instead, I carefully yanked the extension cord out from my barn's outlet, coiled it up, and brought it inside to document it. I took pictures of the junction box, the cord, the footprints on the ground, and the area around the fence. My next step was to contact the local police department's non-emergency number to file a report, because electricity theft is a serious matter. An officer arrived about an hour later. I explained everything, from the suspiciously high electric bills to the moment I caught a figure running away. The officer took notes, snapped a few photos, and asked me if I had any suspect in mind. The only name that sprang to mind was Clayton, given that the extension cord led straight onto his property. The officer gave me a business card and told me to call again if there were any further incidents or if I could gather more evidence. I guess there's a certain procedure for these things, and they couldn't just barge onto Clayton's property without more solid proof. Still, it felt surreal and disconcerting. Later that day, I decided to pay Clayton a friendly visit. I walked down the gravel road to his driveway, feeling my heart pound with a mix of anger and anxiety. I tried to remind myself to stay calm. Accusations can escalate tensions, especially in a rural area where people value privacy. When I knocked on his door, Clayton answered in a calm but somewhat guarded manner. I noticed he'd just stepped away from some kind of interior remodeling project, judging by the sawdust on his shirt. I started off politely, explaining that I'd found an extension cord leading from my barn to somewhere on his property, and I wanted to see if he had any knowledge of it. He immediately feigned ignorance, raising his eyebrows and acting surprised. I told him about the incident with my electric bill and the suspicious figure that very morning. He shrugged and replied that he hadn't seen anything unusual. He suggested maybe it was some random trespasser, or perhaps a misguided person who thought they could get free power. He even pointed out that plenty of folks around here have had issues with teenage pranks, though I found that a bit of a stretch. The conversation ended amicably enough, but his tone struck me as slightly too casual, like someone trying to project innocence without being particularly convincing. I left with no resolution. 2 days later, the same electrician from before returned to check my lines, this time armed with more advanced tools that could detect current usage in real time. We walked around the barn, and sure enough, the reading on the lines was showing that a certain amount of current was being drawn, even though everything in the barn was switched off. It was downright maddening. We looked around carefully, but the extension cord was gone. The electrician pointed out a small hole drilled into the barn's back wall, concealed behind a stack of lumber. Through that hole ran a disguised wire that snaked into the ground, and then presumably under the fence. Whoever had done this was serious about stealing power without getting caught. I was furious and even more unsettled. I called the police again, explaining that someone had escalated the situation from a sloppy extension cord to a hidden wiring job. This time, the police were a bit more proactive. They came out and investigated the hole, took more detailed photos, and asked me a barrage of questions about my relationship with my neighbors. They also asked if I'd had any property disputes recently, or if anyone held a grudge. I mentioned that while I had no direct conflicts, I suspected Clayton because of the proximity and the previous extension cord fiasco. The officer promised to speak with him. What happened next took this story from unusual to downright ridiculous. A few days later, Clayton marched onto my property while I was reorganizing the barn. I noticed him walking up the driveway, so I stepped out to see what he wanted. He was visibly agitated, waving around a piece of paper and shouting about how he had every right to access my electricity. He kept referencing some arrangement from decades ago between my grandfather and his father, or possibly some old family friend. My recollection of my grandfather's business dealings is limited. I was a kid in the 90s, and I certainly wasn't privy to that sort of adult arrangement. Clayton insisted that back in the early 1990s, my grandfather had used electricity from Clayton's father's property for a short period because of some power outage or repairs being done in our area. According to Clayton, that meant he was now entitled to do the same, effectively calling it a reciprocal agreement. The entire notion sounded absurd to me. Even if my grandfather had once borrowed power, that arrangement presumably ended when Grandpa's own electricity was restored, and it definitely wouldn't create a permanent right to free electricity decades later. Moreover, that was an arrangement with an entirely different property owner, as Clayton's father has long since passed and presumably left the property to Clayton. Clayton's piece of paper turned out to be some scrawled set of notes referencing the 1990s, along with a couple of photocopied receipts for something that might have been a generator rental. It was difficult to read. He waved it in my face as if it were a binding contract. I tried to remain calm, telling him I wasn't aware of any such long-standing deal, and that I doubted it held any legal weight today. I also mentioned that the police were already aware of the electricity theft and that if he didn't stop immediately, the matter would escalate. This seemed to infuriate him further, and he stormed off while muttering some choice words under his breath. It was a tense situation that left me feeling extremely unsettled, because people don't typically show up uninvited on rural properties yelling about so-called rights to resources. In the midst of all this chaos, I decided to do some research. I headed down to the local county records office, hoping to find any official documentation about property easements or utility agreements that might give Clayton even a shred of legal standing. I spent an afternoon looking through old property surveys, but I found nothing suggesting that my grandfather had granted or been granted any utility easements involving Clayton's property. The clerk at the county office was pretty helpful and walked me through how to check for all kinds of registered easements, from water rights to road access, but there was simply no record of an electrical arrangement. I left more convinced that Clayton was either extremely confused or was leveraging a decades-old story to justify what amounted to theft. While I was there, I stumbled upon some interesting documents about my land and the farmland around it, including some old diaries Grandpa kept in the archives. It seemed Grandpa once helped a neighbor by running a power cord during a winter storm in 1993 because the neighbor's generator had failed. That might have been Clayton's father. However, there was nothing to indicate this was an official, permanent arrangement. It read more like a neighborly gesture during an emergency. My guess is that the story got distorted over time, and now Clayton believed it gave him perpetual rights to borrow electricity. That, or he was just grasping at straws to rationalize stealing from me. As the weeks went on, I tried to ramp up security measures around my barn. I installed motion sensor lights, put a padlock on the barn's main door, and set up a simple camera system so I could monitor the area from my phone. The stolen electricity episodes continued in a pattern. I'd catch glimpses of tampered wiring or find new footprints in the dirt, but by the time I ran outside, nobody would be there. The camera footage, while helpful, was often too blurry at night to positively identify a face. The police were sympathetic, but said they needed clearer evidence or direct confrontation to file anything stronger than a report. One day, as I was checking my barn, I heard the distinct sound of movement on the other side of the wall. Quietly, I crept out the side door to see if I could catch anyone in the act. And indeed, there was Clayton crouched down, fiddling with some new type of cable that he was trying to snake through the chain-link fence. This time, I turned on my phone's camera and started filming him from behind a stack of pallets, documenting exactly what he was doing. My adrenaline spiked as I realized I might finally have the evidence I needed. After a few moments, he noticed me. He froze, then sprinted back across his property line, leaving the cable behind. I immediately called the police again, explaining that I had video proof now. An officer arrived within half an hour, and I showed him the footage. It clearly showed Clayton on my property, physically connecting a cable to my barn's electrical junction, then fleeing. The officer looked at me and said this was exactly what they needed to pursue charges. I'd never been so relieved. Within a day, the police had a warrant to search Clayton's property for additional evidence of electricity theft. And boy, did they find some interesting things. Apparently, he had rigged multiple lines from different points along the fence, presumably trying to obscure the source. The lines ran underground in a makeshift trench, connecting to his home's circuit panel. It was an elaborate theft system. He'd even installed a secondary breaker box in a hidden corner of his garage to handle the illicit power. When confronted, Clayton reportedly gave the officers the same spiel about reciprocal use from the old days. He was promptly arrested on charges related to theft of services and trespassing. I wasn't particularly happy that it had come to this, but enough was enough. He'd been warned multiple times, had the police talk to him, and I'd even tried reasoning with him face to face. Stealing electricity can be a dangerous fire hazard in addition to being criminal. Plus, I couldn't keep footing the bill for someone else's usage. After his arrest, the local news ran a small blurb about a property dispute leading to charges of utility theft. A few of the neighbors expressed shock because, like me, they never saw Clayton as the type to do something so reckless. Naturally, the ordeal wasn't over just because he got arrested. Clayton posted bail and was back at his house within a couple of days. I could tell he was still bitter because he took to standing at the edge of his property and glaring at me whenever I was outside. I tried not to engage. My only focus was to keep my property secure and let the legal system run its course. Meanwhile, I decided to file a civil suit against him, hoping to recoup some of the massive electricity bills I'd paid. It's one thing to have him arrested for the criminal aspect, but I wanted to ensure he couldn't just shift the costs onto me without consequence. The rumor mill in our small community went wild for a bit. Some folks claimed they'd heard about other times Clayton had borrowed utilities from unsuspecting neighbors, though no one had ever caught him in the act. Others said they'd known he had some grudges against my grandfather, though the details were always vague. A couple of people told me privately that they believed Clayton's father had indeed provided emergency power to Grandpa back in the 90s, but that it was out of compassion during a winter storm that knocked out the lines. No one believed it was anything more than a short-term solution. During all this, another subplot emerged involving a local property survey. It turns out that when Grandpa purchased this land, the boundary lines were drawn so that a small sliver of the property near the back fence might actually have been part of Clayton's father's land. The county had done a thorough survey, and it was corrected years ago, well before I took ownership. But apparently, Clayton either didn't get the memo or was choosing to ignore it. He claimed that the barn sat partially on his father's old parcel, which might justify tapping into my barn's electricity. Of course, that claim was quickly disproven by the official surveys. The barn was fully on my side with no question about legal ownership. Nevertheless, it showed how many angles Clayton was trying to work. While waiting for the legal proceedings to unfold, I got a visit from my insurance agent. I'd mentioned the electricity theft to the insurance company, partly because I worried about liability if the barn's wiring caused a fire on Clayton's property. The agent inspected my barn and recommended a few additional security features, like upgraded locks, a more sophisticated camera system, and motion alarms. I followed the advice because I no longer felt comfortable relying solely on a basic setup. Frankly, I didn't want to wake up one night to find my barn engulfed in flames because of some exposed wire Clayton rigged. A couple of neighbors offered advice too. One woman named Rebecca, who lived down the road, told me she'd had a smaller run-in with Clayton a few years prior, unrelated to electricity. He'd apparently tried to redirect part of a creek that ran between their properties because he wanted more water flow for irrigation. That dispute ended with some official from the Water Resources Department telling him to cease and desist. It seemed Clayton had a habit of ignoring boundaries. Another man, Emmett, mentioned that Clayton might be under financial duress, which could explain why he was desperate for free electricity. But Emmett agreed that desperation doesn't excuse theft or trespassing, especially not after repeated warnings. About 3 weeks after Clayton's arrest, I attended a preliminary hearing where I testified about the evidence of theft. The judge took into account the video footage, the search warrant results, and the repeated attempts to tap into my power lines. Clayton's defense lawyer tried to paint a picture of confusion, that Clayton believed he had a valid agreement. The judge didn't buy it. especially when presented with how clandestine his actions were. The case was bound over for trial, and while the final resolution might take a while, I felt validated that the justice system recognized the seriousness of the offense. Simultaneously, the civil suit moved forward. My lawyer argued that I was entitled to compensation for the extra electricity charges, the electrician's fees, and the cost of installing additional security measures. Clayton's lawyer attempted to dismiss the suit, claiming it was frivolous, but the judge allowed it to proceed. One of the most shocking revelations during the civil process was the precise cost of the electricity Clayton had used. A forensic accountant examined my bills and estimated that he had likely been siphoning power for at least a year before I finally noticed. The total difference came out to several $1,000s. That number floored me because while I'd noticed an uptick in my monthly bills, I never realized just how long it had been going on. Perhaps early on, the amount stolen was small enough to stay under the radar. Meanwhile, tensions in the neighborhood escalated. Some folks took sides, especially those who believed that some handshake deal might have existed decades ago. Other neighbors just wanted to stay out of it entirely, claiming it was too messy and that we should let the courts handle it. A few neighbors came up to me privately, offering moral support and sharing stories of how their own families had at times struck informal deals with each other for equipment usage or livestock grazing. Still, nobody condoned hooking a house's power into someone else's barn without explicit permission. Then came the day of the final confrontation before the actual trial date. Clayton showed up yet again on my property, but this time he was escorted by his attorney and another man who introduced himself as some kind of mediator. They claimed they wanted to reach an out-of-court settlement. Clayton's attorney proposed that if I dropped the charges and the civil suit, they would pay me a lump sum that supposedly covered my extra electricity costs. They also offered a written apology and an agreement to stay off my property. I was open to hearing them out, but I wanted to see the specifics first. The mediator seemed genuinely eager to resolve this peacefully, and I was tired of the stress and legal fees. I gave them a chance to lay out the details. The proposed lump sum was significantly less than the figure my forensic accountant had calculated. When I pointed out the discrepancy, Clayton's lawyer said my calculations were exaggerated. They also refused to cover the electrician's fees or the security upgrades. It was basically the bare minimum that might cover a fraction of my higher bills. I refused on the spot, telling them that if they truly wanted to make amends, they needed to match the actual documented costs and ensure that the settlement included my expenses. I also made it clear that this wasn't just about money. Clayton's repeated trespassing and unhinged confrontations had stressed me out for months. If I was going to drop the charges, I needed assurance that he wouldn't pull anything like this in the future. The mediator tried to be the voice of reason, but Clayton was obviously reluctant to meet my terms. In the end, the settlement negotiations broke down. Clayton started ranting about how it was all our family's tradition and how I was betraying the memory of my grandfather. His attorney quickly ushered him back to their vehicle to prevent him from saying anything else incriminating. I stood there, feeling both exhausted and resolute, determined to see this through legally. It struck me that Clayton might never accept responsibility or see reason. At that point, I decided I would let the court process handle it all. During the following days, I found small signs that Clayton was preparing for a prolonged legal fight. He installed new fencing, probably to keep the police from easily viewing his yard. He reportedly sold off some of his equipment, perhaps to pay legal fees or possible damages. I heard rumors that he was trying to rally community support by painting himself as a victim of an outsider, meaning me. Some of my neighbors quietly confided that he was trying to claim I had forcibly taken over farmland that had historically belonged to his family. These claims had no basis in any real record, but that didn't stop him from drumming up sympathy from those who didn't know the full story. Then, about a month after the failed settlement meeting, the final trial date arrived for the criminal charges. I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer, a file folder of evidence in my hands. The prosecutor laid out the case, presenting photos, video evidence, and detailed electric bills, showing how the theft correlated with my usage spikes. Clayton's defense stuck to their story of a misunderstood handshake deal, but the judge didn't seem impressed. The act of physically wiring his house to my barn without my permission was undeniable, and the measure of concealment, like burying lines and drilling holes, proved it was hardly an honest misunderstanding. By the end of the proceedings, Clayton was found guilty of theft of services, as well as misdemeanor trespassing. He was sentenced to a short probation period, required to pay a fine, and was ordered to cover part of my legal fees related to the criminal case. His face was red with either anger or embarrassment, maybe both. With the criminal matter settled, the civil suit still loomed. The criminal conviction strengthened my position significantly. Clayton finally realized he was fighting a losing battle. His attorney approached my lawyer with a new settlement offer, this time more in line with the actual expenses I incurred. On top of that, they agreed to reimburse me for the extra security and electrician costs. They even offered a small additional amount for the stress and inconvenience. While I was tempted to push for the full trial and possibly get a larger payout, I decided that I valued closure. I was drained from months of tension, rising legal costs, and the emotional toll. So I accepted the settlement with the stipulation that Clayton and I sign a legally binding agreement that he would never set foot on my property again without prior written permission. The judge in the civil case approved the settlement, and I walked away feeling that justice had been served. Clayton might still harbor resentment, but he was on probation and had a court-ordered financial obligation to pay me. That was enough closure for me. For the next few weeks, I observed from a distance as some of Clayton's things were repossessed. Perhaps he had to sell them to cover the settlement. I heard from a couple of neighbors that he complained bitterly about how unfair the court system was, but I never engaged with him again. I also spent some time reflecting on my grandfather's memory. Going through this ordeal, I realized that he probably would have disliked the conflict, because he was known as someone who tried to help folks in a crisis, like lending his generator to a neighbor in the 90s. But that generosity didn't translate into a lifetime free pass for neighbors to siphon my resources. My grandfather also believed in fairness and personal responsibility. If he were around, I'm pretty sure he would have told me to stand my ground and protect myself from anyone who tried to take advantage of me. One final subplot emerged when I discovered an old letter in my grandfather's desk. It was from Clayton's father, dated around 1993, thanking Grandpa for his assistance during a severe winter storm. The letter referenced the fact that Grandpa had run a power line to help keep their lights on for about a week. It explicitly stated that once the local grid was repaired, they disconnected it and looked forward to repaying the favor someday. It was clearly meant in the spirit of neighborly kindness, not a legal arrangement that would last into perpetuity. I found comfort in that letter because it validated my sense that Grandpa was just being a decent neighbor during an emergency. The idea that Clayton twisted that into a lifelong right to my electricity was preposterous. Friends, thank you. See you soon.